Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about physical and chemical properties of matter and see if we can distinguish between those two. So let's start off talking about those physical properties. So these are things that we can look at without actually changing a substance. So for instance, if you looked at the density of something, density is pretty simple. It's simply the mass. Let's say we're measuring that in something like grams over a volume, perhaps that's milliliters. That's the density of an object, is mass over volume, and so it doesn't really matter what substance we're looking at. We can measure its mass, we can measure its volume without actually destroying that substance. We can also look at something and we can look at its color. And you might think about something like melting point and say, well, wait a second, if I melt something, haven't I changed that substance? But if you think about the transition going from a solid to a liquid for something like water, water in its solid form is ice. It has a formula of H2O. Liquid water, we know, has a formula of H2O. So we really haven't changed the identity of that substance just by melting it. It's still H2O. And that idea that we have a given chemical formula that hasn't changed is really important when we're thinking about physical versus chemical properties. So let's contrast those with some of these chemical properties. So chemical properties are things that you have to really change their chemical identity in order to figure out what that property is. So for instance, the flammability of something. In order to test whether something is flammable, we need to burn it. And if we burn it, we've definitely changed it. So for instance, if we looked at a molecule like propane, which is C3H8, if we want to burn that, we have to react it with oxygen in the air around us. And when we do that, we actually make something new. We make carbon dioxide, and we also make water. And so you'll notice that C3H8 that we started with is no longer C3H8. It's now turned into CO2 and water. So we have something completely different, and the only way we could test that property is by actually changing the original substance. Same thing with reactivity. This is also a chemical reaction, so if we test whether that propane, that C3H8, will react with oxygen, we can see that it does, but we wouldn't know that until we actually did the reaction itself. So let's take some time and let's see if we can identify whether the following examples are physical or chemical properties. And so if you'd like to pause the video at this point and try the next several examples, feel free to do that, and then we'll discuss them as we go along. So looking at the boiling point of a certain alcohol, if we wanted to figure out if that's a physical or chemical property, would we need to change the identity? And if you remember back to the water example, we would not need to change the identity because we'd still be looking at that alcohol. It would still have the same chemical formula. So this is a physical property because we haven't changed its identity. If we look at something like diamonds being very hard, well, the hardness of a diamond, in order to test that, we could hit it with a hammer, we could hit it off our head or something, even though that sounds like a really bad idea. But regardless, we would figure out in both cases that it's a physical property. We haven't actually changed its identity. Looking at sugar fermenting. So sugar fermenting to form alcohol. Notice we're starting with sugar. We're ending up with an alcohol. We have changed from one thing to another. So in order to test that fermentation process, we would need to change the identity. If we change the identity, we are talking about a property that is based in chemical, right? So this is a chemical property. If you look at a metal wire conducting electric current, there are metal wires all over the place in your house, and they're all conducting electricity, especially if you have a light bulb over your head right now. And that light bulb, the fact that it's gaining electricity from that wire conducting hasn't changed the properties of that wire. So that is actually a physical property, even though it's conducting those electrons carrying a charge from one place to another. If you look at gallium metal and it melting, again, we have this melting process, even though it seems like it's different, right? It's going from this solid to a liquid, it's undergoing that transition, it's still gallium. Whether it's a solid or a liquid, it's still gallium, so that is actually a physical property. We haven't changed the identity of that metal. This page being white, well, we can look at it. We don't need to change the color of the page to identify that it's white, so this is, again, a physical property. And then finally, copper sheets that are on the outside of the Statue of Liberty have acquired a greenish coating, so that coating is actually something that's going on, a chemical reaction with that copper that we'll talk about a little bit later in the year. So we actually have transformed the copper. It has reacted here. So this is a chemical property. Hopefully you enjoyed this look at physical